The fog rolled across the high ridge like a slow, living tide, swallowing the trees, the rocks, and even the breath of the men who crouched in silence along the frozen ground. Sound hardly traveled, light fractured into pale ribbons. Distance meant nothing. It was the kind of battlefield where even seasoned marksmen doubted their own senses, for the world had been reduced to shifting silhouettes and muffled echoes. Yet in the middle of that uncertainty, one quiet rifleman carried something no one expected: a battered mess hall spoon bent awkwardly along its handle, taped to the side of his weapon as if it were some forgotten kitchen scrap. At first, the spoon was a joke, a harmless piece of barracks humor that lifted the men's spirits. They teased him endlessly, calling it a canteen prank or a field utensil upgrade. But the soldier who made it, Hale, kept adjusting it with a patience that puzzled even those closest to him. He angled the metal under lantern light, studied the curved reflection against drifting fog, and took notes on a small scrap of cardboard tucked inside his jacket. What looked like a crude field modification was, in truth, a personal experiment, born from Hale's curiosity about how fog warped light, and how a reflective curve might exaggerate those hidden distortions. No one believed it would amount to anything, until the day it did. The fog thickened, visibility collapsed, and enemy fire erupted from a range no one could identify. While the rest struggled to determine direction, Hale lifted his rifle, watched the spoon's reflection widen ever so slightly, and quietly announced the correct distance. When scouts confirmed it minutes later, the laughter stopped. What followed became one of the strangest yet most effective innovations of the war. A bent spoon turned into a range-finding instrument, capable of revealing targets no standard rifle sight could touch. This is the forgotten story of how it happened. The ridge overlooking the valley was notorious among patrols for its disorienting weather. Cold winds funneled through the pines, carrying pockets of fog that appeared and vanished without pattern, turning familiar ground into a maze of ghostly shapes. Even experienced marksmen found themselves second-guessing every shadow, every stump, and every sound that echoed through the trees. Hale moved slower than the others, not because of caution, but because he studied how each patch of fog behaved, where it thickened, where it thinned, how it bent light from the pale winter sky above. During one early patrol, he paused by a frost-covered rock and held up his mess hall spoon, rotating it gently as if examining a rare artifact. The faint morning light slid across its curved surface, creating tiny distortions that no one else bothered to notice. To the others, it looked like idle fidgeting. To Hale, it was a moment of discovery. He realized the spoon's reflection shifted in ways that hinted at depth, distance, and density within the fog, tiny clues invisible to the naked eye. It was a strange idea, half-formed, but it clung to his imagination. Back at camp, while the men joked around the fire, Hale quietly polished the spoon's inner curve with a scrap of cloth. The more he watched light move across it, the more he sensed a pattern emerging. A standard rifle sight worked only when visibility was clear, but this curved surface exaggerated differences in brightness and thickness, almost like a crude signal amplifier. As others laughed at his shiny toy, Hale wondered if he had stumbled onto a tool capable of revealing what the fog tried to hide. The next dawn brought a blanket of fog so dense the trees seemed to dissolve into it. Hale stepped away from the platoon's perimeter and lifted the spoon again, trying to recreate yesterday's observation. This time, he angled it toward a cluster of distant pines. The reflection widened, forming a faint halo that pulsed as the wind shifted. He didn't fully understand it, but he recognized consistency. When the fog thinned slightly, the distortion shrank. When it thickened, the halo grew. It was primitive range information, crude, but real. Later that morning, Hale taped the bent spoon to the left side of his rifle stock, tightening the strip of cloth with deliberate care. The men burst into laughter, calling it a fog mirror, a mess kit scope, and a useless ornament. Even the sergeant shook his head, muttering that Hale was wasting his time. But Hale ignored the noise. He tested angle after angle, shifting the spoon one notch at a time, watching how each adjustment altered the way light distorted within the curve. He wasn't building a sight, he was building a sensory tool. By midday, he had identified several consistent indicators. Widening halos meant mid-range targets. Faint flickers meant movement beyond 300 meters. Complete absence of distortion meant empty fog. It wasn't perfect, but it was information no other tool could provide in these conditions. The ridicule continued, but Hale's confidence grew. He had uncovered something no one else saw, a way to read the fog. That night, as the platoon rested along a wooded slope, distant gunfire echoed through the valley. The men froze, struggling to determine direction, each listening for clues lost in the thick haze. Hale lifted his rifle and angled the spoon toward the faint muzzle flashes barely visible through the pale glow. The distorted reflection rippled ever so slightly, a widening halo, then a brief flicker. It was enough. He whispered a precise range estimate to the sergeant beside him. The sergeant scoffed at first. "From a spoon?" he muttered. Hale repeated the distance, firmer this time, confident in the readings he had studied for days. With reluctance, the sergeant passed the information along. Minutes later, scouts returned, confirming Hale's estimate was nearly exact. The mood shifted sharply. Confusion replaced laughter. Suspicion replaced teasing. The idea that Hale's bent spoon could see what their eyes couldn't was unsettling. The platoon's whispers grew by the hour. Some claimed Hale had uncanny intuition. Others insisted he was simply lucky. But Hale knew it wasn't luck. It was physics, hidden inside a curved piece of metal. In the fog-choked woods where normal sights failed, his improvised tool had succeeded. The men didn't trust it yet, but they no longer dismissed it outright. The breakthrough came during a tense defensive mission along a narrow woodland pass. The platoon lay positioned behind logs and shallow foxholes, waiting for an enemy movement predicted by intelligence. Hours passed with no sign of activity. The fog grew thicker, the air colder, and uncertainty heavier. Men shifted nervously, gripping rifles but seeing nothing beyond a few meters. Hale, however, kept scanning with his bent spoon, searching for the faintest distortion. Then it came, a subtle widening of the reflection, just on the edge of perception. It wasn't a shape or silhouette, but a tiny warping of light that he had seen enough times to trust. Hale leaned toward the lieutenant and whispered his range estimate. The lieutenant raised binoculars and saw nothing but blank haze. Yet Hale insisted. After a long hesitation, the lieutenant ordered the men to adjust their angles. Moments later, soft metallic clicks echoed from the fog, the unmistakable sound of weapons being readied. When the enemy emerged minutes afterward, their silhouettes materialized exactly where Hale predicted. The platoon fired the first decisive volley, catching the advancing line off guard. For the first time, Hale's tool had prevented an ambush before it began. Hale began refining his contraption with newfound urgency. At night, under dim lantern light, he filed the inner curve of the spoon with a stone, deepening its reflection and sharpening distortions. He added shallow notches along the handle, marking reference points for specific ranges he had tested in the field. Each modification turned the simple utensil into something more specialized, still crude, but increasingly reliable. Curiosity spread among the men. They approached Hale quietly, away from the jokes, asking him to demonstrate how the distortions worked. He chose a foggy evening near the creek, holding the spoon toward a barely visible stump. As he angled the curve, the reflected halo widened. 200 meters, he said calmly. Then he turned toward a distant rise, invisible to the naked eye. The reflection flickered. 300 or more. Scouts later confirmed both estimates. The demonstration changed everything. The men didn't openly praise Hale. Pride and disbelief held them back. But their expressions shifted from ridicule to cautious respect. By the end of the week, 3 rifles carried makeshift spoons of their own, taped in the same odd position Hale had pioneered. Fog wasn't the only challenge Hale faced. Light conditions varied unpredictably, sometimes sharp and silver, sometimes dim and pale. He spent hours mapping how each condition altered the spoon's reactions. Bright fog produced larger halos. Dim fog muted them. Backlighting inverted distortions, revealing faint movements even when outlines were invisible. He recorded each observation on a small piece of cardboard he kept tucked into his coat. Word of Hale's fog math spread through the platoon. Soldiers who once mocked him now approached with quiet curiosity, seeking range estimates during patrols. Even officers began discreetly asking for his judgment before adjusting firing lines. Hale never boasted. He simply offered whatever information the spoon revealed. One evening, the captain approached Hale with an unusual request. He wanted Hale stationed along the ridge not as a rifleman, but as an early warning observer. Hale accepted, understanding that his strange invention had earned a place, not through recognition, but through necessity. The fog had become a battlefield enemy, and he had become one of the few who could read it. The next major test came when the platoon moved to a valley bordered by steep cliffs. Rumors circulated of enemy sharpshooters hidden in the tree line, experts at exploiting fog and elevation. Standard spotting tactics were useless, distance readings were nearly impossible, and muzzle flashes vanished before anyone could track them. Hale positioned himself behind a fallen tree and scanned the ridge using his spoon's reflection. He noticed faint flickers along the curved surface, not the wide halos of close targets, but thin, intermittent pulses. They were rhythmic, steady, and coming from 2 distinct points along the ridge. Hale relayed the coordinates and distances with quiet certainty. The lieutenant authorized a targeted, suppressive volley. Moments later, distant shouts echoed, and the enemy rifle fire ceased. Hale knew without celebration that his readings had been accurate. The platoon realized their survival had hinged on knowledge no one else possessed. Hale's tool wasn't just a novelty anymore. It was the platoon's only method of navigating the fog-blinded battlefield. What began as a joke had become a tactical asset. As weeks passed, Hale's range-finding technique became more refined. He learned to factor in wind, humidity, and even the color of the sky above the fog. Each variable altered distortion patterns in ways he could interpret with increasing accuracy. He taught others with patience, explaining that the spoon wasn't magic. It was an instrument that amplified subtle cues the human eye usually ignored. But imitation proved difficult. Many men couldn't grasp the nuances, relying too much on the spoon and too little on environmental observation. Some grew frustrated when their readings were inconsistent. Hale realized his skill came from hours of study, not the tool alone. The spoon was only as useful as the mind behind it. One night, the company commander pulled Hale aside and warned him that higher command had heard rumors of his makeshift device. Officers wanted to see results for themselves, and skepticism among them was high. Hale understood the challenge ahead. He wasn't defending a physical tool, but a technique few could replicate. The formal test arrived on a cold morning when thick fog blanketed the training grounds. Officers placed several targets at various distances, all invisible to the naked eye. Hale stood alone with his rifle and spoon, aware of the murmurs behind him, some supportive, some expectant, some dismissive. He angled the spoon carefully, observing the halos and flickers that revealed subtle layers within the fog. His first range estimate landed within a meter of the target's actual position. His second was even closer. By the third, murmurs had fallen silent. Officers leaned forward, studying his technique, surprised by the precision of something made from a mess hall utensil. Hale continued through the test calmly, confident not in the tool, but in the understanding he had earned through repetition and observation. When the demonstration ended, several officers exchanged glances. A few nodded reluctantly. One stepped forward and told Hale, without humor, that his improvised sight might find its way into the company's field manual. Hale said nothing in response, but inside he felt something shift. Validation didn't change his purpose, but it strengthened it. Shortly after the test, the platoon was ordered to defend a valley pass against a suspected infiltration attempt. Visibility was almost non-existent, and nerves were stretched thin. Hale took up position at the forward edge of the line, spoon angled toward the shifting fog. Hours passed in near silence, broken only by distant wind and the occasional rustle of branches. Then Hale saw it. A faint pulse, then another, slightly farther left. The distortions indicated movement at two different ranges, creeping toward the pass. He relayed the information immediately. The captain adjusted the firing line, shifting several squads to cover the blind angles Hale had detected. Minutes later, enemy silhouettes began to materialize exactly where Hale had predicted. The platoon's first volley was devastatingly effective. What could have been a surprise assault turned into a failed attempt halted before it began. The men understood that without Hale's early detection, they would have been caught vulnerable. The spoon had once again seen what eyes couldn't. The legend of the bent spoon's sight began to spread beyond the platoon. Other units heard of a rifleman who could read fog like a map, identifying threats at distances that baffled even veteran spotters. Some dismissed it as rumor. Others sought Hale out during marches to ask questions or request demonstrations. Hale remained humble, insisting the method required patience and practice more than talent. During one march, a sudden exchange of gunfire erupted from a hidden ridge. Panic surged through the column as men dove for cover, unsure of where the shots originated. Hale dropped to one knee, angled the spoon into the fog, and immediately detected a sequence of flickers along the reflection. He called out the range and direction with a calmness that cut through the chaos. The officers redirected fire accordingly, and the enemy position was quickly neutralized. The march resumed, but the men walked with a new reverence. Hale had once again transformed an unpredictable ambush into a manageable threat. In a war defined by uncertainty, his strange invention offered something rare: clarity. The final test of Hale's method came during one of the foggiest nights of the winter. The platoon was tasked with protecting a vital supply route that ran through a narrow forested corridor. If the enemy broke through here, the entire line behind them would collapse. Hale took his position at the very front, spoon angled forward, ears attuned to every shift in the murky dark. Slowly, distortions appeared, multiple halos layered at different ranges. Hale realized with urgency that the enemy was advancing in staggered waves, using the fog as cover. He relayed the information rapidly, calling out distances and angles before any shapes were visible. The platoon repositioned, adjusting firing lines with precision based solely on Hale's readings. When the enemy emerged, their attack faltered immediately under concentrated fire. As the final echoes faded, Hale lowered his rifle, the spoon still taped to its side, scratched, scorched, battered, yet still functional. The men looked at him not with amusement, but with gratitude. What began as a joke had become a lifeline. The bent spoon had done what no standard sight could: turn fog into a readable map, reveal threats beyond human vision, and save countless lives.